I come to this topic as an intellectual historian and as a cultural theorist, committed to knowledge production as a critical vocation, and convinced that the human and social sciences, in serving such a critical purpose, should contribute to what we could call greater social equality and solidarity. And also, one of the things that I wanted to point out in relation to this paper is that I have a background in literature. That's really my area where I once took my PhD. And I also think that aesthetics as such, and that's reflected in my paper, that these expressions are often neglected vehicles for these kinds of critiques. So with this background, I think that global social theory, because that's what we are discussing, it means from my point of view, and I think it's good in this discussion that we sort of, I think it's necessary that we clarify from where we come into these problems and how we understand the topic of the discussion. This thing, global social theory, it can mean at least two different things as I see it. First, it can imply a theory that sort of enables us to relate all the different social systems on our planet to one another. A theory that relates societies to one another. But it can also imply a theory that perceives all the social systems existing in the world as having a shared history, or being expression of what we should call a global society, perhaps. And in this first option, I think that then we are led to... is there an echo here? I should put this a little bit down, I think. The first option would then amount to what we could call a global sociology, or a universal sociology. And there are already many failed attempts at constructing one, and all of them are profoundly Eurocentric. And this is basically the history of sociology, from Hegel and Marx and the founders like Tönnies and Weber and Durkheim and Simmel, and onward to Lévi-Strauss, Bourdieu, and Habermas. They've all done universal sociology in a way. So they've all tried what we are speaking about here as a global social theory. And they have developed global theories of modernity, but with two particular data. And that is, of course, the problem. The second option, a theory through which all social systems in the world may be posited as manifestations of a global history and society. This then would amount to and lead us into theories of what we have called and discussed as globalization. Most of them, too, profoundly Eurocentric. My own contribution is entitled Network Subaltern Emancipation on the Interpretation of Global Contradictions. And I stress that this is an explorative essay, and it belongs to the second of the two options of interpretations of our topic that I just mentioned. So I will spend 5 minutes to just relate and tell you the skeleton of this argument. My main point is that global social theory, in the second sense in which I just outlined it, will somehow, in my view, necessarily also be a theory of the contradictions generated by historical and contemporary capitalism. And I argue that these contradictions are constitutive for modernity and coloniality and enable us to understand the latter two as facets of a single process. And I suggest that such a theory, above all, implies a methodology able to detect the ways in which such contradictions are often incoherently managed by often opposed political, social, ideological, and epistemological formations. I make this argument by exploring three categories: network, subaltern, emancipation. And I start out with the first two, network and subaltern. Because I have had the sense for a long time that somehow everything you read, or everything I've read about, both superficial accounts, but also theoretical accounts, somehow are sort of connected to these two categories, or images. There is a network, and there are those who are, and I call them subalterns, who are sort of, marginal to that, or suffering from it, or so on and so forth. So I wanted to sit down seriously and look at these two categories. And I do this in this paper by looking brief discussions of a film by a Dutch filmmaker and artist called Enjoy Poverty. And also by looking at Manuel Castells' globalization theory. And above all, the first volume of that, it's a 3-volume work. The first volume is called The Rise of the Network Society. And then Gayatri Spivak's friendly exchange with subaltern studies historians on precisely these two categories of subalternity and network. And I suggest that network and subalterns are dominant concept metaphors in much of contemporary efforts to understand our present. One example, Castells describes in his theory how peoples and regions are, as he calls it, switched off from the networks of power and wealth. And he argues that there is, what he says, a systematic relationship between the dynamics of the network society and the social exclusion. In short, network society produces subalternity, just as subalternization sustains networks, the two of them being aspects of one and the same global process somehow. And I then go on to suggest that as categories, network and subaltern make for a reflection which is spatializing rather than historical. And it is thus badly able to theorize processes of emancipation. And I even contend, or I throw out this idea that perhaps we should see network and subaltern as somehow post-historical categories as we use them today. By this I mean that they are symptoms of an ideology for which history has in some sense ended, an ideology that prevents historical reflection, an ideology that misrepresents or conceals the historical contradictions upon which the world system is founded. And there is a brief moment which I dwell on in Castells' theory when he approaches an alternative understanding to this. Discussing the effects of network society, he describes how, as he writes, the downward spiral of poverty, then dereliction, finally irrelevance, operates until or unless a countervailing force, including people's revolt against their condition, reverses this trend, unquote. And so in this moment of his writing, he sort of identifies a dialectical tension between the overlay of the network and some kind of underlying geography of poverty. And we glimpse a third category, which he simply calls a countervailing force. But he doesn't seek to define or clarify this agency or its emergence. He just recognizes that the contradictions of the information age may become so agonizing as to ignite a counterforce, springing forth like some timeless resistance put up by social matter itself. In order to account for this countervailing force, then, I introduce another well-known category, emancipation, beyond the dualism of the network and subaltern. And social and political theory today, I argue, would stand to gain from renewed reflection and collaborative research on a topic that we may call the social emergence of emancipation. By engaging with the social emergence of emancipation, the human and social sciences are likely to arrive at fruitful models for writing what is today being called global history. And conversely, if we engage in global history, and if we avoid reducing that enterprise to sociological schemata governed by the opposites of network and subaltern, we are likely to arrive at emancipation as a political and methodological issue. And what I mean by this is that no matter whether instances of emancipations are successful or failures, they pose methodological questions in the sense that they prompt a narrativization of the world system. The emancipatory event compels us to organize actions and actors in temporal order and in relation to particular political conflicts, cultural divides, material differences, and ultimately then to socio-economic contradictions. And then in the third and final part of this paper, I frame this methodological challenge by dwelling on two phenomena: migration and political protest, which I see as authentic socio-political emergence in the contemporary world. Authentic in the sense that they often expose the contradictions of global capitalism in its dual sense of modernity and coloniality. And in this context, I make another point which I think is important, and that is that the human and social sciences tend to suffer from a structural inability to interpret and explain systemic crises and contradictions. For instance, European history and sociology tend to ignore the structural significance of protest and emancipatory struggle for the realization of democracy. European history and sociology often misrecognize migration as a question of some simple interstate mobility that can simply be redirected, like highway traffic, without addressing the structural causation of this migration by global capitalism. And thirdly, European history and sociology, they rarely recognize histories of imperial dominance and anti-colonial resistance as intrinsic parts of European history, which is a topic I'm sure we will come back to. So having said that, I make four concluding observations for the relevance of this perspective for the choices that we face in this dialogue between North and South, or however we should put it, when we discuss theories of global society. And these concluding observations, I will just state them before I end. By the way, you can put up my first image. Yeah. Okay. Okay. This doesn't. I will talk about it later. First conclusion: theories of modernity and globalization are to be seen as symbolic acts and strategies of containment, which seek to manage and resolve the contradictions and emancipatory struggles generated by the logic of capital. Second conclusion: the conceptual binaries employed by theories of modernity, network and subaltern being one example, mass and individual being another, modern and traditional or primitive yet another, never carry any particular content, but are to be seen as indications of contradictions created by the capitalist world system. Such theories are useful insofar, and perhaps only insofar, as they indicate sites of emancipatory struggle. But here it must also be remembered that such sites of struggle, the social emergence of emancipation, also constitute a limit for sociological and historiographical discourse, and this limit makes itself felt in the inability of discourse to access, account for, or represent popular protest or subaltern forms of resistance. And it's a limit that can be surpassed, I suggest, only through methodological shifts or changed modes of address. It requires often what Rana Itgua calls a writing in reverse, and it also requires a reflection on aesthetics. Third conclusion, although we labor in different disciplines and archives with different empirical and historical materials, and whether in the South or in the North, this methodological focus allows for theoretical convergences and intellectual negotiations. And I would, as my final conclusion, then state that this could mark an affinity between, on the one hand, the dialectical method for detecting contradictions and moments of political emergence, and on the other hand, methods of border thinking and deconstructivism prevalent in post-colonial methods of interpretation. To put it very simply, these methods often converge on the Benjaminian dictum that documents of civilization are documents of barbarism. And in this paper, to end with that, I flash a number of small aesthetic analyses. The three main one being Moussa Touré's film, The Pirogue, Renzo Martin's films, Enjoy Poverty, and then if you could put the next picture up, which could, it's a great poem. This Nalini Malani's installation piece, In Search of Vanished Blood. And so I will just leave that for you to have there on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your introduction to your paper, which is a bit different from what I got as your paper earlier. And it explains a lot more things than it's written here. But I would like to start by I told you this yesterday also, that it was very important to that you put what you call the aesthetics as an introduction to your set of ideas, which starts off with giving us a narrative on poverty. The Dutch Renzo Martin's documentary called Enjoy Poverty. And I haven't seen it, and I didn't have a chance to see it. I don't know if it's on YouTube, but it gave me an entry into your understanding of what you mean by modernity's flight into space. I also didn't know what was Pirogue, so I had to look it up, and the canoe that takes the migrants across from Africa to the Mediterranean also was very important to as an entry point to understand many of your ideas. So thank you very much for this introduction. I would like to start by asking the first question, because in the first part of your introduction of the paper, you take a position that the concepts of nation and class are no more significant. And therefore, you engage with contemporary, take this, yeah. You engage with contemporary notions of network, subaltern, and of emancipation. Why do you substitute nation and class by these three concepts, which you think, and you emphasized it just now, that they are at the moment, the most discussed concepts, and nation and class are substituted by these three?
Well, it's a good question. It's a good question. It shouldn't be understood as I take a position that that nation and class are somehow outdated and we should stop use them. But it's more reflective of my impression from, reading a great deal of contemporary political and cultural theory that there haven't been really any efforts to. There hasn't been really many prevalent efforts to renew the concept of class or the concept of the nation. But there are a number of interesting discussions going on about that. But they are, in a general sense, they have been outflanked by theories of global interconnectedness and universality and cosmopolitanism and globalization and so on and so forth, and that these are sort of the defining terms of by which we tend to describe the world situation today. It's not really and of course, in my view, nation and class, they preserve kind of definitely huge theoretical value, and I don't. And one of the points of my argument is that maybe network and subaltern are not as useful either. But all these questions, all these concepts, they have to be constantly interrogated. So it's not that I propose one thing or the other, but it's I put them under critique here. Yeah.
I was asking this question in context with 2 points. First is that if you look at network society, the integration of each of these countries of the South being networked is very uneven. While the US is completely networked, and about 75% to 80% is networked. China is 50%. Brazil is 59%. But India is 26%. So
you're speaking about internet connections.
Connections. Yeah. And you were talking of Castells. Mm-hmm. And Castells starts with talking of spaces of flow and networked network connections, which allow for the reorganization because networks are very old concept, but in the new way that Castell understands it, it's about the activities that are organized electronically and processes information and networks into and brings people together in that structure. So the second point related to it is that Castells talks about it in terms of the way it affects production, it affects experience, it affects power, and it affects culture. So if networks are important, they are important because of the way it produces experience, power, and culture. And that is not something discussed in the way you understand network, because you would like to suggest that when network is not that significant as much as you go forward, you explain emancipation is much more significant. Though it is used today, it is not about a society where you have a shared history. And yes, that is fine, but insofar as networks produce experience, power, and culture, it's also a way to dominate one part of the world with another part of the world. And if so, then it is a question of power between two parts of the world, which produces it and the other which consumes it. Would you like to engage with that position that is there, which can come out from an assessment of Castell's work?
Oh, of course, yeah. Yes. But, I mean, I must have failed completely if you haven't, I mean, if you don't see that in my paper, because this is what I write about, I think, in my paper. And perhaps it's that, I mean, because what interests me in these two concepts is precisely that network, yes, it's a metaphor for power. Economic power, political power, military power. But I state that, and networks produces exclusion. So in a sense, it produces constantly these forms of, various modes of subalternity. So I do think it engages with that question. And I think one of my points is that it engages that if we speak about Manuel Castells, he engages precisely with this process. And I think lots of theories of globalization do. My addition to that is that this often prevents us from thinking about the world system historically. And in order to think about the world system historically, well, one of the ways in which we could get into that and methodologically do that is to focus on or add or understand and realize that these processes of ongoing networking and excluding, they always generate, as in these aesthetic works that I show, they always generate migration and they generate political protest. They generate instance of emancipation in different ways. And that then becomes my main interest in this paper. But that is not, I definitely could have engaged with, and I think I do engage with this sort of common way of putting up the world in network and subaltern. And I don't deny that there is a certain reality to that, and that there is, but I think, it's maybe it's a question of how I present the argument, because I think that it is there.
Thank you. Today, two issues that you have raised is migration and protest. And we've had a long history of capitalist accumulation where migration has been its key form of reproduction of value. You give an instance of contemporary, the African migration into the Mediterranean. But there's a long history of colonial migration from 15th century onwards. Before that, Europe that's where the term Slav comes from. There's a long history of slavery that entered into the European empire, European continent. And since the 15th century, there has been enormous migration. But the most migration, according to the Commission on Migration, is from south to north, about 40%, but also from south to south, 33%. And there is least from north to south. And from north to north is also 22%. So we are seeing varied mobility processes. And these varied mobility processes are not necessarily always south to north. They are also north to north as well as south to south. If that is so, a historical sociology of capitalist accumulation, how would it refashion itself? Because it's always been put in terms of north versus south.
No, it's an excellent point. I agree. And this is one of the problems with sociologies of migration and migration scholarship, and also of histories of migration, that they tend to focus on north to south migration in the and north to north migration in the 19th century, and then mainly south to north migration in the 20th century. So it's a history of white settlements, and then it's a history of that kind of backlash where the empire returns. So this is true, and I think this is one of the ways in which, as you suggest, we could refashion. I mean, I'm not a sociologist, so I wouldn't be. My project is not to do a historical sociology, but I see your point, and I think that this is a very, very important project to understand and to use migration as and global migration as a way of writing a contemporary history of the world system and its inherent contradictions, because they go between the Kurds in Turkey who migrate as seasonal laborers to various parts of the Middle East, as much as they go between North Africa and Southern Europe or other parts of Europe, as much as they go between East Europe and West Europe, as much as they go from Indonesia to palm oil plantations in Malaysia or Thailand. So this is certainly. I mean, I take this point. It's very important. This is precisely the way in which we could reconfigure migration and see it as an instance to and connect it in a serious way with a sociology of capitalism. Yeah. So that's a good point.
Can I push you a little bit further, because I was not only talking of a historical sociology of migration as a consequence of the development of the world capitalist system, but what does it mean methodologically for a global social theory, which talks about global north and global south, and once it divides itself in these forms, how do you create other ways of thinking which are not north-south, which are specific, contingent, which need not be geographically located and coinciding with intellectual location, but that is universalizing the global northern position, but at the same time not universalizing the global southern position?
But do you think these are useful categories to discuss this, north and south? I mean,
these have been received.
Yeah.
And in your introduction, you suggested that there has been a universalization of these in terms of social science categories from 19th and 20th century related to modernity, etc. So if that is so, and if we have to epistemically refashion, where would we locate that refashioning? I know this is pushing you beyond what you have just said, but you talked of two matters, emancipation and protest. And this the emancipation and protests are occurring at different locales, in context with different processes.
But I'm not sure. I mean,
how do we capture this?
Located geographically, located politically. I locate it politically in these two ideas of migration and political protest. And they, of course, they happen everywhere, but they happen more in areas of stark inequality, where these contradictions are surfacing in various ways. So I would locate this project then, I mean, somehow along the fault lines of the global capitalist system. And these fault lines, they are given different names. In contemporary Europe today, they are located along a Christian-Muslim divide, but also along a renewed and reinforced color line between, I mean, a new kind of racialization. I'm not sure, I don't have the knowledge and competence to speak about the Indian case. I wouldn't be able to suggest where these contradictions would be today. I mean, in this context, I wouldn't even speculate about it. These conflicts are, or these contradictions are, yeah, they can be localized really anywhere in the current global order, but they tend to become visible in the political and cultural sphere in areas where, I mean, I speak about Rana Itgua, but I think his expression in areas where there is dominance without hegemony, because if there is hegemony, they don't become visible in the same sense. So in such areas, for instance, in areas where there is a strong contestation, where there is a strong sort of, which may derive from racial discrimination and oppression, but also economic ones. And so yeah, that would be, and I think that these, I mean, this is an interesting question to discuss. I mean, are they, is the North and South a good way of describing that kind of contradictions any longer? And I would say in some cases it is. And I mean, in terms of academic dependency, I think that we spoke about in the last session. I think that's a great way of deploying that dichotomy, because there is something there to be said for an ongoing divide, but it doesn't erupt in. It doesn't tend to erupt in. Well, it is expressed in a certain way of intellectual migration and in a migration of thoughts and publishing and journals and such systems of power. But other than that, I think that these contradictions and fractures, they are, I mean, it's less useful to speak about them in terms of North and South than to invent other ways of speaking on, but they have to be specific, and I think that's one of the points where we can compare notes.
Yes.
And actually have a discussion about whether this is a useful perspective and whether, I mean, how various systems of knowledge and culture are used to both expose but also to conceal and contain and manage these contradictions.
Yes, thank you. Some more, or yeah. I was wondering, you had a, I want to continue this argument in a different, your answer in a different way, because you talked about protests, and protests are possible there is theories which said that when you have understanding of what is your, and you just said it, domination, and you can confront it, then only there is a possibility of protest. And in the text, you talk about the fetishization of the human rights concept, where also you talk about the fact that human rights may not necessarily capture the content of these protests, because it has an ideological orientation to it. Am I correct? Yeah. So we have larger ideological universals which you are engaging with and contesting with, which includes that both of emancipation and of migration. And so my next and my last question to you would be, if we are displacing nation and class, we are displacing network and subaltern, do we have a conceptual architecture that we can start with? You mentioned racial cleavage, that is there. You talk in terms of capitalist accumulation, so it is about a certain Marxist tradition which talks about value extraction, exploitation, profit making. Yeah, but what is the way we think of as we move forward to assess and examine a global social theory? Because you talk of and I want to end by saying you bring in Jameson and you talk of the three elements that he brings together in discussing. I'm sorry, I'm not good at Greek, so I won't be able to read it out in a...
It's peripeteia and anagnoresis, which means recognition, and pathos, which means pathos.
Pathos, yeah. So how do we move forward in that context? Because you mention them, and you bring pathos back again in your conclusion.
Yeah. Well, I don't mean that these are modes of, as he calls them, they are modes in which history appears to us.
Yes.
So they are in certain ways descriptive of a certain experience of history.
Yes.
Recognition, I mean, I recognize that I have something to do with Donald Trump, and I have to recognize that I have something to do with him. And that is an intellectual insight, which has to be, So it's the moment before knowledge that he speaks about. So that's not a conceptual architecture that we could really, but it's a useful way of going into and understanding the dignity and importance of this methodological challenge. And I think the conceptual architecture could consist of nation, class, subalternity, network. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm not interested in discarding them, but I'm interested in a constant rethinking of them and critiquing them. I'm not interested in building models with them, but I'm more interested in understanding how they are used in various sociological, cultural, aesthetic models, how they're employed in Castells in contrast to Renzo Martens, and how you can read these together. Both of them being a kind of mediation of exactly the similar problem. How is global society organized? And I think we have to pay attention to context, to medium, and to mode of expression in this enterprise. The sociological concepts and the historical concepts will always have the kind of prime importance in this enterprise, and we cannot do without them. So I'm not at all interested in displacing them, but I'm interested in to see how they are mediated, processed, dialectically related to each other in different situations and for different purposes. Some of them are revelatory, progressive, useful. Other ones are completely, worthy of a sustained and harsh critique, because they don't tell us anything about how the world is organized. And so this is my point. The point is to use these not as building blocks in theories about the world, but to use them as dialectically, to see how they are transformed by interests and powers and centers of knowledge in various ways. And I think that investigation is something that would perhaps amount to something called the global social theory, or at least approach, how it could be carried out.
So,
yeah.
Thank you, because it just reinforces what Raven ended up by saying in the earlier presentation, that we have to move in many ways to open up a global dialogue.
Yeah.
And yours would be one further way to do so.